Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Bill Maurer. I'm the Dean of the School of Social Sciences here at UC Irvine, and I'd like to welcome you to this fireside chat with Dr. Mohamed El-Erian to discuss his new book, which we have here, The Only Game in Town. We don't actually have a fireplace, but you can imagine that one is happening. It would be nice to have on a kind of blustery day like today after the rain and hail, but instead, we have this lovely setting where we can once again welcome Dr. El-Erian back to UC Irvine. This is his second time to campus to address us here around a book. We hope that when the next one comes out, you'll come back and talk about that one too. And this event is being sponsored by the School of Social Sciences together with the Center for Global Peace and Conflict Studies, which is directed by my colleague, Professor Julia Elyachar, in the Department of Anthropology and Economics over to my right. She will be introducing Dr. El-Erian in a second. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the structure of today's event. We're really thrilled that Mohamed could be here with us to speak about this book, but we do have very limited time. So things are gonna kind of go fast and furious once we get started. We will be discussing his book with him for the first half an hour, 40 minutes or so. And then we're going to open it up to some questions before transitioning over to a book signing. So there are books available for purchase outside. If you haven't got a copy, you're welcome to go and get one. And I would also like to thank all of you for taking the time to come to discuss this very important book. It's interesting the level of attention that it's gotten so quickly after it was released. I think we'll be speaking a little bit about how this probably speaks to some anxieties that we are seeing manifested in our country and across the globe right now around the economic situation and how it spills over into so many other pressing issues that we face right now. These are precisely the kind of issues that we try to grapple with in the School of Social Sciences because our deal is thinking about the human condition in all of its forms and ways forward, even when it seems like sometimes there isn't a way forward. So with that, let me hand it off to Professor Elyachar, who will introduce Dr. El-Erian, and then we'll get started.
Okay, thanks so much, Bill. I don't want to take too much of your time, and it's always a dilemma with Dr. El-Erian because there's so much to say. There's the bare bones introduction. Dr. Mohamed El-Erian is chair of President Obama's Global Development Council, chief economic advisor at Allianz, and the former CEO and co-chief investment officer of PIMCO. There's a whole CV that we could spend a whole day talking about. But what I want to do also today, as we're an academic institution, is to do as we would introduce all of our academic speakers. And we will add there that Dr. El-Erian, of course, has his undergraduate degree in economics from Queens College with first-class honors. It goes without saying. His master's and doctorate economics degrees in economics from Oxford University. He holds an honorary doctorate degree from the American University in Cairo and is an honorary fellow of Queens College at Cambridge University. Mohamed El-Erian has published widely, prolifically, and brilliantly on topics ranging from international economics, US and global politics, behavioral economics, the January 25th revolution in his native Egypt, Occupy Wall Street in one of his other hometowns, New York, and on all aspects of finance and monetary policy, not to mention the New York Jets. He's a member of the Financial Times A-list of writers, monthly column in foreign policy, and I can go on and on and on, but I don't want to take all too much of the time. But I will go on to the first book, When Markets Collide, was a New York Times and Wall Street Journal bestseller. The book won the Financial Times and Goldman Sachs Business Book of the Year Award in 2008, was named a Book of the Year by The Economist, and was called one of the best business books of all time by The Independent. One thing I do want to add with cutting some of this short, again, focusing on some of the other honors, which include a Creative Leadership Award, the Nell and John Wooden Ethics in Leadership Award, a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Egyptian Cancer Network, and the Visionary Award from the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C., in addition to so many others. We also just wanted to note one of your more recent efforts, which is really close to our hearts here at the School of Social Sciences, which is the establishment of the El-Erian Institute for Human Behavior and Economic Policy in partnership with Queen's College and the Faculty of Economics at Cambridge, which looks to combine economics and finance with neuroscience, psychology, politics, and behavioral finance to better understand how people actually make decisions rather than how theory assumes they will. And that's something that we'll get into a lot in our discussion of the book, and is something here at the School of Social Sciences we care deeply about. So with no more delay, let me introduce, please join me in welcoming Dr. Mohamed El-Erian here today. Thank you. Thanks, Mohamed. Okay, so let's just jump in here. So
before we jump in,
okay.
can I just say how delighted I am to be here, and Julia and Bill, thank you very much for inviting me. It's wonderful that you're all here. I have very close friends in the audience. That means a lot to me that you're here. And let me just share a secret. These chairs are great. Okay, I'm actually tempted to have a bit of a nap because they're so comfortable. So I forgive you for not having the fireplace.
At least you're
but thank you very much,
yes.
and it's wonderful to be back at UCI.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, so we approach this as one of our ongoing series of scholars who are visiting, talking about their books, which means that we convened a reading group. And we had a reading group last week with professors from School of the Arts, Department of Economics, Department of Anthropology, all over the campus, and of course undergraduates, graduate students, member of the community, and we all discussed your book. And one thing that was striking, and everyone spoke about as well, was how important the book was to us as scholars, as students, as investors, as people with pension funds, and as grandparents and parents. And we wanted to engage with your thought and with the book in the short time that we have today on all of those levels. So to begin with, for those in the audience who have not read the book yet, can you give us, your short statement of why you wrote the book, what it's about in the short version?
So I wrote the book because principally I have a 12-year-old daughter, and I worry a little bit about her future. And of two very conflicting narratives out there. There is the Warren Buffett narrative, which is anybody born today is the luckiest in generations. And there's another narrative that you hear on the political side, which is for the first time ever, there's a risk that the next generation will be worse off than this generation. And these are two distinct narratives. And I started this book by trying to think about this book, by trying to figure out how does one get a good understanding of what the future is really like. And I thought there's no better perspective than that of central banks. Central banks are these unknown institutions that operate in very mysterious fashion, that do not like to be in the spotlight. And yet in the last few years, they've been pushed into the spotlight, and they've taken responsibility for delivering economic outcomes. They've taken sole responsibility for delivering economic outcomes. Not out of choice, but because nobody else was stepping up to their responsibility. So I decided that the perspective of these institutions may shed some light on what's ahead. And I was hoping to be deterministic. It ends up that it's not that simple. So the book has basically three messages. One, the road that we've been on is ending. It is a road that has been supported by experimental policies by central banks because our political system has failed in terms of responding to the challenge of generating inclusive economic growth. But it is now ending. And signals are all around us if we just pay attention. If you're in finance, the signals are simple. 30% of government debt now trades at negative interest rates. Think about that. You lend your money to somebody and you pay them for the privilege of lending money. That doesn't make sense, but that's reality. You have a country like China, very well managed, starting to make mistakes. When your best student starts failing exams, you have to ask what's happening at home and what's happening at school. And then there are signals that all of us know. There's a sense of anger in society, which means that anti-establishment parties and movements gain traction, even if their messages are way too simple. And yet they gain traction because people are angry. Inequality is the worst we've seen for decades, if not centuries. There is no global policy coordination. So the system is telling us this road is going to come to an end. And that's the first conclusion, is we are coming to the end of the road. The second conclusion is what comes after that is not predestined. It's still subject to choices that our governments make and that we make as a society. You know, if your statistician is what they call a bimodal distribution, right? It's like a camel with two humps. Things can go either really well or really badly, but they won't stay in this muddled middle. If you prefer images, it's what the British call a Tjunction. The road that you're on ends, and there are two roads coming out of where you're coming, and they're very different in terms. Either you're going to turn one way or you're going to turn completely the opposite way. And that speaks a little bit to the two narratives that you keep on hearing. Either it's going to be a great future or it's going to be a really awful future. And the probabilities are equal. And I hate saying this. The book would do much better if I came out and said, it's this. But that would be intellectually dishonest. Which leads to the third message of the book, is that we, as individuals, as households, as people who work in companies, and people who form governments, can actually tip probabilities meaningfully if we understand what it is. And this is the behavioral angle. And the bad news for us all is we do really badly when faced with this Tjunction. We get paralyzed. And most of us will end up either ignoring it, denying it, and then waking up and realizing we're not ready for it, or we'll fall into the trap of active inertia. Companies do this all the time. So you're coming to something, you know it's not working. You know that the normal way that you operate is not working. But you end up doing the same thing over and over again. The non-politically correct example is the American tourist in Paris. She or he goes up and asks a question in English. The French person either doesn't want to understand or doesn't understand English, one of the two. In most cases, the tourist will repeat the same question in English but louder. That's called active inertia. IBM did that on the eve of the PC revolution. They saw that their world was coming to a T-junction, that the PC would fundamentally change the computing world. They analyzed it. They realized that they had to do something different, and what did they end up doing? More of the same. So the third message of this book is be careful. Because of the way we construct it, because of our unconscious biases, because of our blind spots, we will most likely not navigate well what's ahead. But the good news is there are tools that come from a lot of the behavioral science that helps you do that. So, you know, the book is simply about the road we're on has been a pretty special road, not great, but it's been artificial. It's ending. What comes next is not yet predestined. And we as individuals can and should develop the three things you need to navigate this. And this is where I'll end. It's about having resilience. It's about having optionality to change your mind as you get more information. And it's about having agility. And those are the three things that are going to distinguish people who do well in this new world from those who struggle.
I want to follow up on one thing from there. The first that comes to mind is you more than anyone have this gift of a turn of phrase that captures a moment, captures something that we haven't yet been able to put into words. All that noise and signal, as in your last book, you pointed out, and you wrap it up in a way that people can comprehend. One of the things that I found really moving in the new book is the way in which you also said that you felt some responsibility, since you dubbed the term of the new normal to describe what was going on, to make clear that we can't just keep stumbling on. there's a number of terms that you've just mentioned here that you bring up, and ranging from the bimodal distributions and the inclusive growth, which is a fascinating phrase. But we want to ask you a little bit more about the Tjunction, which you've described now, but where, how, because we talked about this a lot in our group, and some of the follow-up questions will get to this. On the one hand, we could say, well, the United States is on a secular decline, just like, the British Empire was. And it's just secular on the way down. This is inevitable. It's a long-term macroeconomic turn. But on the other hand, we have a chance of showing and making clear to act. How do you deal with that long-term historic transformations that are going on versus the political decisions that we're facing right now?
So first, you're kind to say nice things. You don't need to say nice things.
Sorry, it's hard not to.
But let's start. So we've been in, quote, the new normal. And for those of you who don't know this is a term that my PIMCO colleagues and I came up with in 2009. We were coming out of the financial crisis. And the view then was this was a V-shaped. We came down very quickly, we're going to come up very quickly. Or it's a rubber band, it stretches and goes back. When we looked at it, we realized that's not the case. This is a much bigger shock. We are not going to come back quickly. We are going to be stuck in this period of unusually sluggish growth. And then we tried to figure out, how do you communicate that to people? And we played with lots of phrases, and we came up with the notion of the new normal. Okay, that there will be a new normal, that it's structural. It's a little bit like a teenager where things change and you don't go back to what you were yesterday, but you evolve, and you can evolve into something better, you can evolve into something worse. Very different than what we are as adults, where we're much more cyclical. We have good days, we have bad days, but we're much more stable overall. So we came out with this concept of the new normal. It was ridiculed to begin with. I remember going to Washington, talking to a policymaker, saying, the policy response has to be different, the mindset has to be different. And I remember being told the concept is idiotic. Fast forward 7 years, it has become conventional wisdom. And it has acquired two titles that I think are much more powerful than the new normal. One is the new mediocre, right? And the other one is secular stagnation. That yes, we are stagnating, and it's a secular trend, it's a long-term trend. So for me to tell you that the new normal path is ending is not easy, right? You never want to give up something when consensus has reached to it, but it is ending, right? And that's because we cannot run a system as sophisticated as this system is at low speed. Things start to break. Politically, they start to break. We're seeing it every single day. Okay, people are angry. Why? Because low growth is not enough to meet their aspirations and their hopes for their kids. So the political system starts having problems governing. And anybody who has watched the debates will know that. If I had stood up here a year ago and told you that not only will Donald Trump be the leader on the Republican side so far, but that Hillary Clinton would be threatened by a self-declared democratic socialist. Think of what would you have thought of me if I said that to you a year ago? But that's reality. And it's in Europe too. The anti-establishment movements are getting very strong. The second reason it starts breaking down is because inequality gets to a point to whether you're right or you're left, you start worrying about it. Why? Because it's no longer about income and wealth, but it's also an inequality of opportunity. And the minute you start talking about inequality of opportunity, people pay attention, because most people have kids, right? So they care about these things. So if you look, the current system is simply crumbling from the fact that we've tried to run it politically, financially, and economically at low speed. And it's not built to run at low speed. Now, the easiest thing to do is to say it is secular stagnation, it's going to get worse. But that ignores some fundamental strengths we have. First, we have lots of underutilized people that have enormous potential. They simply are not being empowered. Second, coexisting with the first. Second, we have amazing technological change going on that is turning our society upside down And so far, it has been name-specific, firm-specific, and sector-specific, and it's about to go economy-specific. And let me give you a simple example that's in the book to show you how powerful this is. Most people my age have stayed at Hilton hotels. It took Hilton 100 years to make available 700,000 rooms around the world for its clients. And they had to manage hotels, in some cases they had to build hotels. It took Airbnb 6 years to provide 1 million rooms. And they didn't build a single hotel. And Airbnb was not started by people who had any expertise in hotels. It was started by people who had 3 gifts. 1, they understood technology. 2, they understood that people want greater control over their outcomes. They want fast solutions, they want efficient solutions, they want to be able to interact. And 3, they understood that there were massive assets that weren't being used. Uber is another example of that. Rent the Runway is another example. So the reason why you can't be too negative is because you have underutilized resources, you have technological innovation that's unleashing things that were unimaginable. And third, you have a ton of cash on the sideline. Companies today have more cash on the sideline than they've had for a very long time. So I'm not a buyer that it necessarily will go to pieces. It could go to pieces, okay? But that's not necessary because we have all the ingredients. It is not an engineering problem. This is an implementation problem. People know what's needed. We just need a political system that's able to implement it.
Well, on that exact point, in the book you outline a number of policy proposals that you think will help ensure that we'll turn the right way on that T. I wonder if you could say a few words about those, and also, that's in the policy prescription and what should happen, but also tell us what you think is going to happen.
Yeah, the what should happen, I think, is pretty clear. In fact, if we were to fill this room up with economists, God forbid, but if we were to do that.
We have economists in the room.
Yeah, no, but if we were to fill it, I am willing to admit that, I'm willing to predict that most of them would agree on the following. And to get most economists to agree on something is really hard. Okay. They'll disagree on which is the most important, so they'll disagree on the relative importance, but they'll agree on the absolute importance. And there's only 4 things that are needed. The first is to develop the right growth engines. About 15, 20 years ago, we lost our way on growth. We somehow stumbled into the belief that finance was an engine of growth. That somehow, if you unleash finance, that finance will power you forward. Remember, we didn't used to call it finance. We used to call it the financial service industry because it served somebody else. But somehow, we got lost into this and we created this notion, we fell in love with this notion that finance was a standalone. Some people even suggested it was the next level of capitalism. Agriculture, industry, manufacturing, services, and if you're really lucky, you get to finance. And you know what? If finance is that good, let's regulate it less. So we started regulating it much less. We started competing to be the financial center of the world. London versus New York versus Frankfurt. And if you were too small, if you were Ireland, if you were Switzerland, if you were Dubai, if you were Iceland, it didn't matter. You could grow your finance sector 3 times, 4 times your economy. That's how crazy it got. So the first thing is to just understand that we fell in love with the wrong growth engine and we stopped investing in what makes countries grow sustainably. It's about infrastructure, it's about education, it's about the right tax system. It's the bread and butter of growth. We have not reformed our tax system since the mid-80s. What we've done is we've implemented all sorts of little tweaks to it, mostly to satisfy lobbies, and now we have a tax system that discourages growth. We haven't invested in our people. We haven't retrained. We've invested very little in infrastructure. What happened in Flint, Michigan is a reminder of how bad things can get. So the first answer is let's go back to what makes economy grow. And I think most people have a pretty good understanding of the necessary condition. They may not be sufficient, but the necessary condition. Second, we stumbled into a world where on the demand side, we decoupled the will to spend from the wallet to spend. In Europe, it's the clearest example. You bring everybody together in a club, and then you have Germany with the wallet, but has no will to spend. You have Greece with the will to spend, but no wallet. And somehow, they're supposed to get along. In this country, it's much more subtle. In this country, since the global financial crisis, 100% of the incremental income has gone to the richest 5% of the population. Now, I am not making a political statement. I'm going to make an economic statement. The rich spend less of the incremental dollar that they earn. It's called the marginal propensity to consume. So if the incremental income is going to the rich and they spend less of it, you will have a problem of insufficient demand. Okay. If you don't have enough demand in the system, companies will not produce as much as they would in the past. So in Europe, it is fiscal policy differences that separated the will and the wallet. In this country, it basically came down to income distribution issue. And the one component that redistributes income, fiscal policy, has been frozen for 6 years. We have not had an active budget in this country for 6 years because our politicians can't get together to do that. We've had one budget deal mid-year, but we have not had an active budget. So we roll over the budget every year. The third issue, and this is something that really matters for the young people in academic institution, is excessive indebtedness. It's called the debt overhang. Countries, people, companies at some stage just get too much debt. Now, too much debt does two things. One, it crushes you. Two, it stops people from investing in you. Because if you're a new investor, why would you ever invest in someone who's already overburdened with debt? So there's no fresh oxygen coming in. So the system starts imploding from within because the capital doesn't flow through the system as it should. So the third issue is we need to make difficult decisions about over-indebtedness. And it's really hard. It's, what do you mean we're going to forgive debt? I was responsible and this person was irresponsible. You're going to forgive their debt? You hear this about Greece all the time. But let me tell you, economics is very simple. If you don't forgive Greece's debt, you're talking about lost generations of Greeks. In this country, in 5 years' time, it's going to be about student loans. If we don't do something about it right now, we're going to have the same issue. And then the fourth element that you need is just better policy coordination. Each country right now is on its own. It doesn't believe that there's a global system anymore. So you have this absurd situation whereby we all live in the same room. The world is like one big economic orchestra. Okay? How you play in your section really matters to the other sections. So now we have a global orchestra that is forced to be in the same room, that is forced to interact, but they have different musics, and we have no conductor, no director. We have people from the Laguna Playhouse that can tell you what it's like to put actors on with no director at all. No matter how good they are at their lines, it will sound completely incoherent. And that's what the global system is doing now. It's sounding completely incoherent. So we need to invest in what generates economic growth. We need to do a better job at matching the will and the wallet. We need to make difficult decisions on over-indebtedness, and we need to collaborate better and have a better global conductor. These are all things that can happen. And the good news is because of the amount of cash on the sideline, you don't need a big policy bang. You need a small policy bang, because the minute you do a small policy bang, you will unleash all this cash on the sideline. That's what should happen. What's likely to happen is we're going to continue like this until we get a crisis. And then there's going to be a moment of truth when we hit that crisis, where either the political system will respond, and then low growth becomes high growth, financial volatility becomes financial stability and inequality starts coming down, or the political system will really fail us, then low growth becomes recession, financial volatility becomes financial crisis, and inequality becomes social tension. That is the starkness of what's ahead of us. That is the Tjunction.
You know, I wonder if you want to say a few words too about some of the other things in the book that actually sort of surprised us when we were reading it and we got toward the end on preparing ourselves to navigate a world of no longer things falling out into a normal distribution, but a bimodal one. And in particular, we were struck in reading the book and discussing it with each other last week, the importance that you place on diversity and building teams in organizations from a variety of backgrounds and perspectives. That's something that we pride ourselves here at UC Irvine as one of the most diverse campuses in the country. But it also seems that there's some programmatic suggestions there in the book for us as we think about preparing ourselves and our students and our children for navigating this new world.
Yeah, and I tell you, that's where I lost a lot of my economist colleagues thinking, why would you take a turn to these soft topics? Okay, and yet these soft topics are critical to success on the hard side, on the hard topics. There's a few things we know about how we behave when faced with a bimodal distribution. And as I mentioned earlier, we don't do well. Why? Because most of our lives are conducted on the basis of what's called a normal distribution. A normal distribution is like a bell-shaped curve. It's incredibly comforting. There's a high probability of a certain outcome. There are tails. Things can go really badly or things can go really well, but they're thin. Now, you know how to navigate your lives on this. For example, there will be a meeting today at UCI at 3 o'clock, and therefore you are here. That was your dominant expectation, and you came. Now, it could be thin tail, what they call the left tail, thin tail that it was canceled and no one told you. But you still came because you said, you know what, yes, that tail exists, but it's very thin. Alternatively, the good tail, the right tail could have been you come here and they serve you a 5-course lunch. And therefore you didn't have lunch beforehand. But you didn't do that, right? You said, maybe I'll get a cookie. Okay? But even then, this is a public university, right?
There's
but
only
you know,
smart water, I'm afraid, yeah.
The smart water, okay. But basically, you know how to conduct your life, right? Okay? And that's how we, over the years, and I'm willing to bet most of the things you do in life is on the basis of these very well-shaped, well-behaving, bell-shaped distributions. That is not the world we're living in anymore. The world we're living in is what's normal economically, politically, financially, negative interest rates. Just keep on repeating this in your head, negative interest rates. Right? That's how absurd it has become. What's normal is becoming less and less likely. And we're going to tip. Now, if you are facing that, you need cognitive diversity. You need an ability to think differently about what's ahead of you. You cannot have the same mindset. That's what got IBM into trouble. That's what got Pan Am and TWA. When I was growing up, Pan Am and TWA were completely dominant. They had the very lucrative cross-country routes and the international. Along came little Southwest. Southwest was nothing. And it was very strange. It was they would use one type of plane, and they would have regional hubs, regional routes, and then they would have hub and spoke routes, completely different from what Pan Am and TWA was doing. Pan Am and TWA realized that this may be disruptive, but because they had no cognitive diversity, all they could do was do more of the same, and they ended up going bankrupt. So this cognitive diversity, to be able to ask questions differently, to be able to have different points of view, is really, really important. And you only get cognitive diversity through other types of diversity, gender, race, etc. So if you want to navigate this, you've got to take really seriously cognitive diversity. And the warning I have about the book, and I admit my own mistakes, is it's so easy to get it wrong. When I was at PIMCO, I prided myself to not have blind spots. And I used to do these brown bag lunches where the rules is you come in and you can talk openly about anything, and anything said in the room stays in the room. And as people got comfortable with the rules of the game, they became more open. And I was sitting in a meeting, and a colleague that I respect enormously, a woman said to me, "You almost ruined my life." And when someone says that to you, really? And I said, "How did I do that? I'm sorry, how did I do that?" And she said, "Do you remember when one of our competitors was having a problem?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Do you remember what you asked for?" I said, "Yeah, I asked for a daily update because I know how busy you are, and I know that we have a small window of exploiting this opportunity, and unless I ask you for an update every single day, okay, the routine takes over and you're not going to be able to focus on it." And she said, "That's absolutely right." She said, "Do you remember what time you asked for your update?" So I said, "No." She said, "You asked for it at 8 o'clock in the morning." And I said, "Okay." And she said, "Do you know what happens when the CEO asks for an update?" I said, "No." And she said, "There's a conference call that goes on." You know what time that conference call was? I said, 6:30. I said, "I don't know, 6:30? And she said, "Yes." Do you know what it's like for a single parent at 6:30 in the morning? And that was, oh my God, I had a blind spot. I had a complete blind spot. And I said to you, "I'm sorry, I made a big mistake, but I wish you had told me, because whether the update was at 8 in the morning or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, didn't matter." And that's when we went into looking at the science of blind spots. Why is it that even people who have the best of intentions end up having blind spots? Why is it that we all have unconscious biases? And you realize that unless you have this ability to question, unless you have true diversity around you, you will fall victim to that trap, even if you don't want to. Right? So I cannot stress enough the importance of this cognitive diversity.
Thanks.
Let me follow up with one last question from our end, with also the kind of theoretical or conceptual diversity that you also stress. One term of yours that we also picked up here at UCI at CGPAC, the Center for Global Peace and Conflict Studies, was thinking the unthinkable, which has to do with all these conditions that were impossible to consider and they become normal. Including there is also the externalities of economics or any model that makes assumptions in order to start model making. In the book as well, there's so many political factors. It's a call as well for public policy as it is a book about monetary theory. How do you think we're in a phase where we really have to go back to that old term of political economy, or what needs to happen as well for economic theory? And just to point again to something that I've seen you writing about a lot, about your own education, which was quite diverse also cognitively in terms of models to think about things. What do you think we need to do as educators?
Wow. So who am I to tell you what you have to do as educators? And you're doing a great job, so I don't need to tell you. I was lucky. When I was 13 years old and my father was posted to France, we used to get 4 newspapers every morning. And I have a very cost-effective, let's not waste money attitude. So I said to my dad, "Why are we getting 4 newspapers? We're wasting money. We just need 1 newspaper. News is news. Okay? Why are we getting 4 newspapers?" And he said, "Well, this newspaper here, Humanité, is published by the Communist Party in France. This newspaper here, Le Figaro, is published by the right-wing establishment. And these other 2 newspapers are centrists. And the reason why we get 4 newspapers is because I want you to realize that the same bit of news can be interpreted differently. The same bit of news can be interpreted differently. And you need to be open to different interpretation, because no one has a monopoly over the right interpretation." Then when I went to Cambridge to do my undergraduate, it was a very confusing time because in the first year, you learned 4 different schools of macroeconomics. Neoclassical, Keynesian, Marxist, and Neo-Ricardian. And what they were trying to tell you over and over again is not what you think, it's how you think. The how is as important as the what. Now, this is important because I'll link it to the other question. The world we live in is the intersection of 4 circles: economics, financial markets, because they have a huge impact, politics and geopolitics, and policy. And the 4, where they interact, where they intersect, is where our lives are determined. But we have tended to bring people up in each of the circles. Interdisciplinary work is actually something quite recent. Before you specialized. And what we forgot is that first, the world isn't determined in one circle, it's determined in the intersection of the 4. So you better understand how the 4 things interact. And secondly, we realize that you can have vicious cycles. So let me give you an example, economics and politics. Low growth makes the political system more fragmented. Why? Because politicians respond to people being angry. So if you are a Republican and you're looking for re-election every 2 years, it is most likely that your most serious opponent will come from your right, not from your left. And if you're Democrat, increasingly, your most serious competition will come from your left. So you, when you are on Capitol Hill, cannot be seen to be collaborating too much with the other side. So low growth makes people angry. Angry means fringe movements come up. They pull apart the 2 dominant parties, and then the 2 dominant parties cannot govern properly. If they cannot govern properly, the economy does even worse. So then you have spillover, spill back, spillover, spill back, and then you get into these vicious cycles. Unless you understand how these circles interact, right, you won't be able to see your way through, and then you become hostage to these vicious cycles. So you know, one thing I really admire about UCI is the amount of multidisciplinary work you do, because that's where the real world solves. It doesn't solve neatly in each circle. It solves at the intersection of these circles. But I have to tell you also a warning for all of the students in here, and then I'll shut up.
Okay.
But I was going up for my university interview, and my economic teacher said, here, read this book. It had just come out. It was a bestseller. Read this book, and I don't care what you do in your 45-minute interview, but you've got to mention the book, because they're going to be so impressed. So I go up, 40 minutes into the interview, I haven't mentioned the book. And there's no way I can mention the book because we're not on any topic that's even close to the book. So I suddenly say, oh, that reminds me of the book, which of course it didn't at all. And I did this wonderful pivot. 2 people were interviewing me, one who had been taking notes all the time and the other one who had been asking questions. The one taking notes sort of put his pen down, smiled, and I should have realized then there was something wrong, and said, tell me about this book. And I went into this perfect monologue, gaining confidence. I had practiced it 100 times. You know, I was there, as my daughter would say, I was nailing it, it's fine. And then he asked me one question that demolished the whole thesis of the book. One question. And I couldn't answer, I didn't know anything, right? And then he went up, it was in his room, he got an off-print of the review that he had done of the book. That totally destroyed the book, okay? And, you know, it's also important, and that's why you need to read different things, because, as he said to me, simply because it's published, it doesn't mean it's right.
Let's take a few questions. We've got the microphone in the back. We're going to take a couple first from members of this group who read the book together last week. So if I could ask Mir here, one of our economics undergraduate students, and a microphone is coming your way, and just stand up and wave your hand. There you go. And then we'll get a couple, and then a couple from the floor.
Hi, my name is Mir. I'm an undergrad here. My question is, you mentioned a couple times of the Tjunction in the book. So how do you foresee this Tjunction happening? Is it more like a car crashing into the wall, or it is more like central banks are making their tricks so we can have a more smooth transition? Thank you.
So it won't be central banks. Central banks are almost exhausted, okay? And now they're splitting into three groups, and this will make it very current. There's one group, the Fed, which has realized that prolonged reliance on experimental policies starts having collateral damage and unintended consequences, because you're not solving the fundamental problem, you're just giving painkillers. And if I give you painkillers for 7 years, at some point you're going to start worrying about the side effects of these painkillers. Right? The Fed cannot produce any of the four things I mentioned. All they can do is simply try and buy time for the system. And that's what they've been trying to do. So you have the Fed that says, you know what, I don't want to do this really anymore, and I'm lucky enough that my economy is relatively okay that I can get out. So the Fed could do more, but is no longer willing to do more. That's why it hiked interest rates for the first time in December. At the other extreme, you have the Bank of Japan that shocked everybody by taking interest rates negative and got the completely wrong response. It got the opposite of what it had hoped for. Why? Because at that point, people said, if the Bank of Japan is doing all this crazy stuff, it must be ineffective. And then in the middle, you have the European Central Bank that's going to meet on Thursday that will probably go even more unconventional, and that's going to work. But if you look at this diversity, this disparity, this divergence of central banks, they are no longer able to deliver the good outcomes. We've relied on them for a very long time, and they have given us as much as they can, and if we continue to rely on them, they will go from being part of the solution to being part of the problem. So don't expect central banks to do that. Now, do we crash? It depends whether we take a side road before we get to the T. Okay, if we continue heading this way at the same thing, then we're going to find it very difficult to navigate the turn. But there's lots of things we can do in the run-up to this. The responsibility lies mainly on the politicians. As I said, this is not an engineering problem, and they don't need a big bank, they just need a small bank, right? And if they do that, then you can transition to a better world without the trauma of hitting a wall. Okay? If we don't do anything at all, we will hit what I mentioned earlier to Bill, the crisis point. Markets will become very, if there are any investors in this room, you'll know that 3 times in the last year and a half, it felt like the world was really being shaken in a fundamental way, right? January was the last time that it felt that way. So we will end up having a major financial instability that will either focus minds, because it will say the problem is here, we've got to do something, or will show that our political system really has failed us.
Okay. Let's take one more from the group that read the book last week. Nelson, I'm going to call on you, and the microphone is coming, and then I'll take the question here.
Can I just jump in with one thing? It'd be great if people can identify themselves so Mohamed knows who he's talking to. That would be wonderful.
I'm Nelson Marr. My question is that your book mentioned about is to accept a new norm, also implement economic structure reform. That is one of the methods, okay? And before his Tjunction. China, about 3 years ago, they already talk about a new normal. Also, they started economic structure reform about 3 years ago. So what do you think about China? Are they doing right? The second question is that are they facing what kind of challenges? And also, do you think they be able to successful or not? Thank you.
So 3 years ago, the China challenge was what's called the middle income transition. Okay, you go from being a teenager to an adult. Right? Things change, you have to change the system, you start getting a job, you mature. And the big challenge for China was, would it be able to manage this middle income transition? And certain things happen in a middle income transition, which is growth slows down. And that makes sense. You cannot grow at 10% forever. You become too big to generate the same growth rate on this. So this was something that the Chinese were handling really well, and it wasn't easy. There are only 5 countries that have managed this middle income transition well, and none with the complexity that comes with China. It's China's size and everything else. So they were dealing pretty well with the middle income transition. Then the world slowed down on them. Now China exports a lot. So suddenly they didn't just have the structural transformation problem, but they had it become much more challenging because they had a cyclical slowdown. Then the third element kicked in. China has ended up making the same mistake inadvertently that we made as a country 15 years ago. As a country 15 years ago, we decided that it was a public good, it was a social good for more people to own their homes. After all, who could possibly oppose greater home ownership? So we started encouraging home ownership. And we went too far. We created a housing bubble. So suddenly you pursue something that's socially good, you enable it to go too far, and then you deal with the consequences of a bubble. China has made exactly the same mistake as we made, but with their stock market. China rightly believed that by having more people own stocks in China, they will have a greater stake in the success of market-based reforms. So it was a social good to have more people participate in the stock market. And it went too far. It created a stock market bubble. So China now has also had to deal with a stock market bubble. So you have a difficult structural issue. You have cyclical headwinds because the world is slowing down, and you have to somehow diffuse a financial bubble. That is what China is facing today. My own sense is that they are up to this challenge. That's my sense. Okay. Why? Because they learn really quickly. Really quickly. Chinese policymaking is very different from our policymaking. Chinese policymaking is, I know where I want to end up in 20 years' time, but I don't know every step of the way. In fact, I only know the next 4 steps. But as I take the next 4 steps, I'm going to learn from my experience, and I'm going to learn from other people's experience. And I'm never going to lose sight of where I want to be. We do it completely differently. We start out by saying, we know where we want to be, and then we say, we have to know every single step. Now, of course, we can't know every single step, so we bring the objective further ahead of us. And then we end up deciding what we're going to do for the next day, right? And that's how our political system has become. You hear about short-termism. We've become very short-term. Okay, the stock market has become very short-term. Our political process has become very short-term. Why? Because we somehow think that we need to know every single step, and that's unknowable, right? So what we need to learn is that it's okay to have an objective out there. That is our North Star. And it's okay to just know the first few steps as long as you're willing to learn and adjust. And China is incredible at course correcting. It's an incredible economy when it comes to course correcting because they learn very quickly. So, it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be smooth. But my fundamental baseline is that it soft lands at 5.5% to 6.5%, and they're able to navigate these 3 challenges.
Why don't we take the one right here from the floor? The microphone is coming your way. Yeah. And you'll need the mic so others can hear you in the back.
I'm an 80-year-old citizen of the U.S., and so I have seen a lot of ups and downs. And I'm wondering, since your book came out, who are some of the influential people who have shown an interest in your premise? And how do we lobby them to show support for your ideas so that we indeed don't crash into the wall?
We got the Dean of Social Sciences at UCI.
I don't know how to answer that question without sounding incredibly arrogant and without sounding pompous, but thank you for the question. I think the reason why, I started out, I really care about my daughter, and I really care about what future she has. Right? And if anybody thinks that you can isolate yourself from the reality around you, would you buy a good house in a bad neighborhood? You wouldn't. The neighborhood really matters. Right? So I'm just telling you. So this is an attempt for a call for action. And it's an attempt to say, you know what, this is not about engineering problems. This is about implementation problems. We can solve this. And we can solve this. This is not, but the political system has to step up to its responsibility. Now, that message resonates really well among the technocrats. The technocrats have no problem with this. The central banks have thanked me for saying something they cannot say. The title of the book, The Only Game in Town, comes from a central banker. He stood up at a conference of central banks. I was in the room and said, quote, we're the only game in town and we don't like it because we can't deliver. Now, they can't go around saying that because they're in the business of calming markets. They're not in the business of panicking markets, right? So the technocrats are on board. The central bankers know that they're near the exhaustion level. And it's just trying to get the politics. Now, I will tell you, most of the politicians know this stuff. It's simply that we don't reward them for collaborating and getting things done. We are a very angry electorate, right? And we need to somehow understand that we also have a responsibility in order to encourage the right messages. But I'm afraid, and to answer the earlier, I'm afraid that we're going to have to hit a crisis point, a real crisis point, before you get the response. That no one right now is willing to take the political risk of doing things that upset the extreme base of each party. And that's just the reality we're in.
So there are no influential people around that we could show that there's some validity to this.
So I don't know who you know, okay, but I can tell you that the message resonates really well, okay. And if I see the amount of interest that there's been in it, not just, again, this will sound arrogant. A book on central banks should not make it to the New York Times non-fiction bestsellers list. It does not belong there, okay? But it made it there. Why? Because I think people are fundamentally insecure. They see strange things around them. They see a system that hasn't responded. They see a political silly season, right? And they realize there's something going on this. So it's just increasing awareness and hoping that people will do it. I'm actually not that pessimistic because it's not an engineering problem. We just need the wake-up call.
Well, I think in the interest of time and in having some book signing take place, I'm afraid we don't have time for any more questions in this forum. But I did want to take a moment for all of us together to thank Mohamed for coming and talking about the book with us in our fireside. We do have a couple of tokens of our appreciation. I would say small, but one of them is a little big, and they're coming this way. Peyton and Joanna are helping out. First, we have a copy of UC Irvine's 50th anniversary commemorative volume.
Thank you.
And then something that I think you have to open here.
So this is the bit I hate most. What am I opening here?
There's tape on it. You have to do it.
So do they get to see it before I get to see it?
Yeah. You can be in front.
No, let me see their reactions first, and then I'll decide whether I want to see it. Oh, wow. I love it.
There you are.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So,
love it. So look at it. Warning, T, yellow, okay. Yeah. That's great. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you again.
No, thank you.
So the book signing will happen over there. If you could line up to the other side of the whatever that thing is, velvet rope. And again, thank you all so much for coming this afternoon.